Royal Guard shatters 300-year tradition to save a life. What happens next stuns the nation. Buckingham Palace on a cold winter morning is never devoid of sharp winds, blowing through the canopies of ancient trees, creating a whistling sound like a reminder of the eternity of time. The yellow leaves, withered and fluttering in the air like distant memories that cannot be grasped. Against the gray sky, heavy clouds cast shadows on the ground, making the air even colder. And there, standing firm like a statue, was William Carter. William Carter is not special just because he is a Royal Guard, but because he embodies all the values that the Guard team represents: absolute discipline, silence like stone, and an unwavering spirit. He always stands upright, without a single movement, without a single expression, and especially never reveals any emotions. To everyone around, William is one of the rare guards who have maintained that composure through many years of service. His professionalism is not only reflected in his stern demeanor or absolute silence, but also in the reason he chose this profession. For William, this job is not just an obligation. It was a way for him to reassure himself, a way to extinguish the painful memories from the past, the feelings he had never dared to confront. Today, he still stands here, in the cold of winter, on the palace steps, guarding a world he has chosen. A world without emotions, without wounds, without pain. The surroundings of William have always been like that, unchanging and cold. The other guards stood firmly beside him, all silent and still like stone statues, not a single one of them moving even slightly. Standing before the majestic palace gates, they resembled cogs in a perfect machine, with no room for error. Every movement, every step of theirs is controlled perfectly, absolutely without any mistakes. This is their job. This is the rule they live by. The scene before me could be considered an eternal painting of Buckingham Palace on a winter morning, the dim light of weak rays of sunshine piercing through the gray clouds, highlighting the grandeur of the castle and its sturdy walls. The tourists hurriedly took photos, continuously chatting and laughing. The calls to each other, the hearty laughter rang out endlessly, but all of it brushed past the guards like the wind. As for William, he felt nothing but the biting cold and the eerie silence of the palace, as if everything around him was immobile, inviolable. Although tourists come and go, the guards still stand there, doing their job. There is no change. There is no sign of life other than the noisy sounds of tourists. Everything is proceeding according to plan. Nothing can change that. But then something unexpected happened. A small sound, but strong enough to disrupt the silence that enveloped this place. That was the sound of crying. At first, it was just a vague, fleeting sound, coming and going like a gentle breeze. The tourists didn't pay any attention to it, continuing to immerse themselves in the joy of the tour. However, for William, who was too accustomed to silence, that sound could not escape his attention. It was a difference in the atmosphere, a sign that he couldn't ignore. Tears dripped in the cold air, like cracks breaking the solidity of the facade William had built over the years. Although he tried not to pay attention, the urgency of the cry seemed to constantly urge him. That cry was not simply the cry of a child. It carried within it despair and helplessness that he could feel through each tiny sound. However, a part of him, the part that had been shaped by discipline and rules, tried to reassure himself, telling him that this was not his business. The question repeated in his mind: can I let emotions influence my work? Is it possible to make a mistake? He tried to ignore it, not looking towards the source of the crying, holding himself together like in the past days. But then, as the cries became clearer, closer, seemingly impossible to ignore, he couldn't help but look back. Before long, he saw a young girl, probably around 6 years old, standing outside the fence, her hands gripping the iron bar of the palace gate tightly. The girl's messy golden hair flew wildly in the wind. Her sparkling blue eyes, filled with tears, looked straight at him. The girl's face was full of anguish, and her cries echoed in despair. Each cry was like a knife cutting into William's mind. In that moment, everything seemed to stop. The world around him was no longer a still picture. A strong feeling of conflict began to rise within him. He stood there, like a soldier facing a challenge greater than himself. The rules of the Guardian, everything he had learned and been trained in, told him that he was not allowed to abandon his post, not allowed to move, not allowed to do anything except stand there, unresponsive. But in his heart, another part asked, is it right to turn a blind eye to a child's pain? Reason wanted him to continue standing still, adhering to the rules. But his heart, though it had learned to fall asleep for a long time, could not ignore that cry. A feeling of confusion welled up within him, and he realized that this was the moment he could no longer ignore. Rules or conscience, he had to decide. At this moment, William Carter is no longer just a royal guard, he is a man faced with a great humanitarian choice. Buckingham Palace on a winter morning, as always, immersed in a serene atmosphere where everything is prepared to perfection, where no disturbance can alter the order. The guards stand firm, motionless, eyes fixed straight ahead, faces expressionless. They are the embodiment of discipline, of an unbreakable rule. Each of their steps is precise, each movement is under absolute control. But in this moment, amidst the silence and coldness, William Carter felt a deep conflict rising within him, like a fierce wave crashing against his hardened heart. Military rules require him to stand still without distraction. That is the duty of a royal guard, to always stand straight, always be steadfast, and not let anything disturb the tranquility. However, when his gaze accidentally lingered on the image of the tiny girl gripping the palace gate tightly, he felt a powerful wave of emotion rising within him that he could not suppress. That girl, with her tangled golden hair and swollen eyes from crying, was standing there like a sign of suffering that none of the guards could see. Her cries were not loud, but they were deep and full of despair. Every time she called, each word was like a knife cutting into William's mind, tearing apart the facade he had tried to build over the years. Stay strong, William, he told himself in his mind. He tried to force himself to turn away, to continue doing his job as a guard should. But he couldn't. The girl's cries were something stronger than the discipline he had learned. In his heart, a question arose, hard to extinguish. How could he remain steadfast when a life was in danger right before his eyes? His heart beat faster, and the conflict within him began to become clearer. The military discipline he once revered, which he thought would help him maintain peace in his life, has now become something that binds him in an unbearable silence. He knows that if he doesn't take action, no one else will. But if you do it, you will have to face consequences that you cannot foresee. The girl kept crying, please, someone help me. My mother. The girl's voice trembled, full of urgency. These words hit William's heart like a strong blow, making him unable to stand still for another second. The feeling of sorrow and anxiety made him unable to ignore it, even just a little. This scene reminds him of distant childhood memories when his mother was seriously ill and he could do nothing to help her. In those days, he could only stand by, helpless and lonely, as his mother suffered without anyone to help. Now, the sound of the little girl's cry, the call of my mother, inevitably makes him think of his own mother, of those days, of the numbing feeling of seeing his loved ones in pain while being unable to do anything. That feeling of sorrow and helplessness surged within him like a wave, filling him with an uncomfortable obsession. At that moment, the military rules, the reminders he had memorized over the years, all seemed to vanish. He was no longer a guard. He is no longer a soldier who only knows how to follow orders and maintain order. He is a human being, a man standing before a difficult decision, where conscience, humanity, and responsibility intertwine in an inextricable spiral. William could no longer stand still. He took a deep breath, feeling his heart pounding in his chest. The decision has been made, even though it means he will have to face consequences he cannot foresee. He stepped out of line, his footsteps firm yet filled with anxiety. A strange and uncomfortable feeling spread within him as he approached the little girl. Everything seemed to slow down. The surrounding sounds faded away, leaving only the sound of his footsteps and the girl's crying. When he got closer, he knelt down, his gaze deep into the tear-filled eyes of the little girl. He gently asked, "Where is your mother?" The little girl looked up, her big round eyes filled with fear and despair, staring straight at William. She choked up, her voice hoarse from crying too much. "Mom fell. Mom won't wake up anymore." These words were like a knife cutting into William's heart. The girl pointed towards a woman lying motionless on a nearby bench. The woman looked very frail, showing no signs of life, and that weighed heavily on his heart. William hurriedly ran to the woman. He checked her condition. hurriedly feeling her wrist to sense the pulse. In just a few seconds, he realized that she was experiencing a severe hypoglycemic episode. Her pulse was weak, her breathing very shallow, and she did not respond to his approach. If not treated in time, she could lose her life right here. Without thinking any further, William stood up and shouted loudly, "Medical assistance! Everyone, help!" His voice rang out coldly in the still air, shattering everything around. The palace medical team quickly arrived, but all eyes were on William, and the tension immediately spread everywhere. In just a brief moment, he had violated the clear rules of the guard, and everything he had done until now suddenly became a controversial act. The feeling of anxiety enveloped him, but a part of him felt relieved, as if he had just done the right thing in his life. William Carter stood silently, his eyes following the medical team tending to the woman he had just saved. She had been taken away, and he was left standing alone in the vast courtyard of Buckingham Palace, where the only sound was the wind howling through the cold air of the winter morning. His light footsteps seemed unable to break the silence, but within him echoed another sound, a call that could not be ignored. Right or wrong. When he returned to his old position, William noticed the eyes of the other guards were fixed on him. The cold eyes, devoid of any sympathy, were only filled with harsh judgment. A sense of unease began to envelop him, even though his actions were a lifesaver. But he understood that, in the world of the royal guards, there was no place for weakness or emotions, only discipline. And you, someone who has violated that, now have to face the consequences. When he stopped, the tension in the air was like something tangible. No one said anything, but the looks from the teammates were enough to say it all. Everyone continued to stand still, like stone statues, but the silence was no longer peaceful. What he just did was an unacceptable act of defiance within this team. You stepped outside the rules, acting on the urging of your conscience rather than orders. And in the world of the Guardians, that is a grave mistake. The next day, a disciplinary meeting was convened. William, still in his guard's uniform, stood before the senior commanders, whom he had respected and served for many years. But now the feeling of guilt and tension made him unable to stand straight, as usual. He could only stand still, his hands clenched tightly, his eyes looking down at the cold ground. The royal guard is not allowed to be distracted by anything, even human lives. The superior's voice rang coldly like an unchangeable sentence. His superior, a senior officer with a stern face and an unchanging gaze, continued speaking, each word striking William's heart like a hammer. You have violated the most important principle of the team. You are not allowed to do anything other than carry out your duties. No matter the reason, you are not allowed to let distractions affect your work. Every word from his superior felt like a bomb exploding in William's head. He knew he was wrong, but the internal conflict was so strong that he couldn't ignore it. While everyone around him only saw a guard who had failed in his duty, he saw a man who had to choose between two important things: responsibility to the team and conscience towards a life in danger. He could not stand by, could not turn a blind eye to a little girl in distress, to a mother who was unconscious. He knew that by saving that person, he had done something that the team could never forgive. The heavy sense of responsibility in William's heart made him unable to counter his superior's criticism. He remained silent, not saying a word. Everything is too clear. He understands that this is the result of what he has done. The criticism continues to echo, but in his mind, there is only one thought left: I will have to pay the price. After a short period, when the superior finished their criticism, the atmosphere in the room became suffocatingly silent. And then the final decision was made, like an unavoidable sentence. William Carter, you have violated the fundamental principles of the Royal Guard. You are suspended from duty immediately. Your Royal Guard title has been revoked, and you will have to leave the ranks. These words were a huge shock to William. He couldn't believe his ears. He, a Royal Guard for many years, who always adhered to discipline, now has to face the shame and irreparable loss. He did everything for one reason only. He couldn't stand still when someone needed help. But now, he has to pay the price for the action that his conscience urged him to take. When the decision was announced, William felt like he was being pushed into a deep pit, with no way out. There was no comfort, no words of encouragement or sympathy. That is the world of the military, where everything is decided according to ironclad principles, where there is no room for emotions or humanity. He left the meeting room in silence, but in his heart, the feeling of being lost and empty could never be filled. His years in the Guard unit, the sacrifices and relentless efforts now seem to have become meaningless, all because he followed the call of his conscience, a call for which he must now pay the price. The tension within the team, the constant resistance in his heart, everything seemed to have come to an end. But one question still echoed in William's mind. Was his decision right? And if given the chance, how would he do it differently? After the tense hours at the disciplinary meeting, William Carter stepped out of the conference room with a feeling as if everything had collapsed before his eyes. He was no longer a royal guard, no longer the man he once took pride in being. Everything changed in an instant, an action he couldn't overlook, even knowing it violated the team's most crucial principle. As his footsteps echoed through the empty corridor, the silence within him felt emptier than ever. But what he could never have expected was that the change did not come from within the military, but from society outside, where ordinary citizens were paying attention and speaking out about his actions. After William's story was reported by the press, it quickly became a hot topic in the media. The Royal Guard breaks a 300-year rule to save a life. That is the headline that major newspapers keep mentioning, creating a strong wave of public opinion. The public, who usually pay little attention to the lives of the Royal Guards, are now beginning to view William's actions with respect and admiration. The newspapers hailed him as a hero, someone who did not hesitate to save a life even at the cost of breaking the strict rules that the Royal Guards had followed for centuries. The public's attention to William's actions did not stop at just the articles. Discussions on social media and online forums have also begun to erupt. People began to question the rigidity of the rules, asking whether in modern society people should care for each other more than just adhering to soulless principles. The call for a change in the rules of the Royal Guard began to spread, and William, despite being dismissed, became a symbol of the most humane and noble aspects of society. However, no matter how heartwarming the public recognition is, William still cannot completely escape the weariness of his soul. He had lived his whole life within the confines and discipline of the Guard, where every action had to adhere to rigid principles. He understood that his actions would come at a cost, and that cost would not only stem from losing the title he had dedicated so many years to. But a letter he received one morning changed everything, making him unable to feel anything but a glimmer of hope. The letter came from the royal palace, where he had once stood firm like a statue. In the letter, there was an unexpected invitation. William Carter, the Royal Guard, invites you to meet Queen Elizabeth at the palace. Everything seemed to become vague to him. He couldn't understand why the Queen wanted to meet him, someone who had been dismissed just for breaking the rules. But curiosity and respect for the royal family made him unable to refuse the invitation. The day William stepped into the royal palace, he felt as if he were stepping into a completely different world. The large doors opened, leading him into a formal room where Queen Elizabeth was waiting for him. Contrary to what he had imagined, the Queen did not look at him with the cold or stern gaze that other leaders he had met used. On the contrary, she looked at him with a gentle smile, devoid of any criticism, just calmness and an unexpectedly warm welcome. When William stood before the Queen, a sense of pressure and anxiety welled up within him. He didn't know what to say and just stood there in silence, not daring to look her in the eye. But in the face of his silence, the Queen spoke up, her voice gentle yet full of understanding. "You have defended not only duty but also humanity," the Queen said, her gaze warm yet strong. "In today's era, sometimes we must recognize that principles are not always the right thing." He acted according to his conscience, and that is something I greatly appreciate. This compliment from the Queen deeply moved William. He couldn't imagine that someone as influential as her could evaluate his actions in this way. To him, everything he does is just a normal action, stemming from conscience and compassion. But listening to her, he realized that it is these humanitarian values, these values of human kindness, that truly constitute great service to a nation. You have done what I believe many of us would not have the courage to do, the Queen continued. You have protected not just a life, but also the ideals of compassion and love in this society. That is precisely what the Royal Guard needs to protect. William stood there, speechless. He felt a recognition from the Queen that he had never thought possible. It was in that moment that he realized that even though he had lost his title, the humanitarian values he pursued were the most important thing. He no longer felt like a failure, but rather someone who had acted according to his own conscience, despite strict principles. This meeting not only changed William's perspective on the duty of a guardian, but also made him realize that service is not just about protecting the institution, but about protecting people, protecting humanity. And from that moment, he began to think about his future differently. The price he had to pay for his actions was no longer failure, but an important turning point, an opportunity to start over, to continue pursuing the values he had always believed in. The Queen's praise opened a new door for William, a door he had never thought of before. But from now on, he will never forget what she said. Protecting humanity is truly protecting a nation. Um, no one could have imagined that a small action, seemingly insignificant, could change an age-old system. The recognition from the Queen and the strong public support created a powerful momentum, prompting people to reevaluate the rules that had existed for centuries. It was an inevitable change, a change that William Carter helped bring about. After the meeting with the Queen, changes began to take shape within the military. The strict regulations of the Royal Guard, which have been maintained for 300 years, now have to face a reality that they cannot ignore. In a rapidly changing society, protecting life and humanity has become more important than ever. The rule of silence, of not being distracted by anything, even human lives, has been reconsidered. Military leaders, who have always held the view that a rule is a rule, are beginning to realize that sometimes in emergency situations, flexibility is essential. Each of William's actions now is not just a defense of a principle, but a symbol of a new perspective on the role of a guardian. He is no longer a part of the rigid system, but rather a part of an organization that is gradually learning to adapt to the new era. The regulations have been adjusted to allow flexibility in emergency situations where human lives must be prioritized. For William, this change is not just about the military adjusting the rules. It was a change in perspective, in the way he and his comrades understood their responsibilities. After all, he had returned to his position, but this time, his feelings were no longer the same. He was no longer just a royal guard, but someone who had proven that there are greater values than rigid principles, values of humanity, protection for the weak, and the willingness to sacrifice for what is right. Standing in Buckingham Square under the early morning sun, William felt the change not only within himself, but also in the way those around him perceived him. His teammates, who might have never understood his actions before, now look at him differently, not with criticism, not with coldness, but with respect. He did what they dared not do, protect a life despite all the rules and regulations they had committed to. The new image of the Royal Guard is gradually taking shape from William's story. They are no longer just warriors who protect the royal family and the nation's assets, but guardians of life, those who listen to the voice of conscience. They are role models for the new generation of the military, individuals who serve not only for honor, but also for humanity. The story of William Carter is not only remembered in the military, but also in the hearts of the people. The newspapers have continuously praised his actions. His story is shared everywhere as a reminder that sometimes resilience is not about sticking to a principle, but knowing when to change, standing up for what is right, even when facing difficult challenges. William has become a symbol of courage, not just because he saved a life, but because he dared to stand up against a system he knew was imperfect and sought to change it. Change in the military is not just about adjusting rigid regulations. It is adaptation, the step of an organization that knows how to observe and learn from reality, from mistakes and from successes. Military commanders, while still maintaining dignity and discipline, now understand that there are situations where rules cannot fully resolve the issues, and sometimes the right action lies beyond the predefined patterns. William not only demonstrated courage in an emergency situation, but he also quietly initiated a revolution within a strict military system. He has proven that humanistic values can harmonize with discipline and seriousness, that sometimes to protect a nation, it is not only about fighting on the battlefield, but also about preserving life and humanity. And in an organization like the military, this is an indispensable step if one wants to survive and thrive. Standing among his comrades, William Carter felt a surge of pride. He was no longer just a royal guard. He was a change maker, someone who had helped the army broaden its vision of responsibility, conscience, and truly important values. His actions changed rules that had existed for centuries, but more importantly, they made him realize that sometimes the most important thing is not the rules or principles, but doing the right thing, even if it means breaking everything. William Carter was no longer just a royal guard. Having gone through harsh events and profound internal changes, he became the epitome of a true soldier, someone who understands that duty is not just about protecting an honor or a position, but also about safeguarding the core values of humanity. The day he decided to ignore the rigid rules to save a life, he not only changed himself, but also contributed to shaking the foundations of a system that had existed for hundreds of years. In the past, William always considered duty to be everything. The military principles, the regulations on discipline, coldness, and indifference, all of these are things he had to strictly adhere to. He had never doubted those rules. They have been upheld for centuries, and in his eyes, they represent the existence of order, a way to preserve the dignity and honor of a royal guard. But the act of saving a life in an emergency moment made him realize that sometimes higher values surpass those rigid rules. Humanity, compassion, the willingness to sacrifice for others, that is what truly defines the essence of being human. William learned that sometimes doing the right thing is not simple at all. Sometimes it can lead to unforeseen consequences. But sometimes these very decisions can be a turning point that changes an entire culture, awakening a system that has been living in rigidity and closure. He realized that no matter how important the rules are, human life and humanity must always come first. And at this moment, he understood that he had done the right thing, even though it might cost him everything. The story of William Carter is not just the tale of a royal guard who defied all principles to save a life. It is also a story of change, of awakening in a world full of immutable rules where everything seems to have been predetermined for ages. William is no longer just a soldier guarding the palace, protecting the royal family. He is the one who dared to stand up against a system that had existed for too long, the one who brought about the necessary change for the military, for society, and for himself. On the day he returned to his position, the looks were no longer the same as before. His teammates, those who had once criticized him, now looked at him with different eyes. Not coldness, not contempt, but respect. They saw him dare to confront the rules and change them for something more important, to protect life, to uphold the noble human values. And in William's heart, a great pride surged up when he knew he had done the right thing. The story ends with a simple yet meaningful image. William stood silently in front of the gates of Buckingham Palace, watching a child walk by. The child was unaware of the changes William had helped bring about, of the sacrifices he had faced. But for William, this moment was a sign that he had succeeded. He smiled gently, a smile not of self-satisfaction, but of a person who has realized that sometimes it is not the grand things, but the smallest actions that can change the whole world. He protected not only the palace, not only the values that the army had steadfastly maintained, but he also protected humanity, the fundamental values of mankind, something he perhaps had never truly realized before facing that difficult decision. In that moment, William understood that the change he had made, though small, was enough to alter the world he was living in. You don't need to stand firm rigidly anymore. That's not what's important. The important thing is that you did the right thing. And that righteousness not only changed his perception of the world, but also altered the way those around him viewed a royal guard, a soldier who not only knows how to obey, but also knows how to live with heart and mind. William's story is a lesson about change, about doing the right thing, even when facing difficulties, and about how a person can make a difference right within their own environment. Sometimes it is the actions that transcend rigid principles that are the most important steps in building a better future for everyone.